All right, chapter 7. So today we're going to talk about planting and transplanting techniques, the types of planting, stock, different planting methods. We're going to go over staking and guying of trees, newly planted tree maintenance, and transplanting palm trees. Woohoo! So with plant selection, remember you select a tree that is in healthy condition with vigorous root growth and top growth. Examine the entire tree, especially the roots and the root ball. And that's critical. Survival and new growth are very dependent on water absorption, its capacity, and stored carbohydrates in the tree. So the amount and condition of the roots greatly affect the transplant success. If the roots are no good, the tree's probably not going to make it. You know, if it's got enough energy stored in some of those twigs and leaves, it might pop out again, but if it's not able to replace what it's putting out in energy through new water and nutrients to those roots, the tree's just going to die. So critical. Okay, so the different types of nursery stock. You have bare root. Let me put my little pointer up here so that everybody can see. Makes it a little easier anyway. Oops, spotlight. Okay, there we go. So you got bare root here, and this is how it ships. It's usually covered in a gelatinous goo that is a polymer base that keeps the roots moist, because if they dry out, they die. So don't expose your roots to air. We'll get into that in a minute. And burlap is the other method. It's field dug and then wrapped up in this ball and either tied or put into a wire basket with strapping to lift it. And then the other method is just container grown. And the thing you have to watch with them is how long have they been in that container and what condition are those poor little roots in. If you've ever planted a tree or taken a plant out of a pot, you know what I'm talking about. But we'll get into more of that in a minute. Those are the three main types. Okay. Well, now it's not clicking forward again. Let me close this out. Maybe that'll do it. All right. Obviously, my screen is not wanting to cooperate today. Sorry, y'all. Come on. Click through. There we go. Finally. All right. Bare root trees. All right. So, like I said, they come without soil. The good thing is they're smaller usually, and they weigh less, and they're much easier to transplant. So you plant them during the dormant season before the roots and buds begin to grow. And dormant seasons change depending on your area. So, here in Georgia, you're going to be, looking at probably late November to March 1st, roughly around in there. Although with the way it's been getting hotter, I'd say probably want to get it in before February, the end of February for us in the Piedmont area. And, but it's different in different parts of the country. So just be aware of that. Should you move or if you're already there. So yeah, but you want to put them in the ground before the roots and buds begin to grow. So during that dormant season, which is kind of a misnomer, right? Because trees that are already in the ground, we know that during the dormant season, that's when they grow roots and buds, right? Or when they grow roots, at least. Buds don't come out until spring. But, but the whole thing is get it in the ground when it's dormant, and then the roots really start to creep into that soil before it gets to be hotter, which, they need to try and get over that transplant shock as quickly as possible. So dormant season is critical. Keep the soil, keep it moist, keep the tree roots moist, or store them cold, 32 to 40 degrees. And that's a lot hard to do. Not too many people have giant freezers for trees. So keeping them wet is the best option. And then they should be planted as soon as you get them, really. I mean, if you open up a bag of bare root stock that you get from a forestry service, you really want to get that in the ground that day or the next day. You can maybe heal them in somewhere and keep them moist to last a week or two, but you're really taking chances. So getting them in the ground quickly is critical with bare root trees. All right, this is how they look when they get there. They either come in a box on the right, and then like I said, they'll be wrapped in plastic with a wetting material, or they'll have the polymer base gel on it to keep it moist. The pine seedlings, that picture on your left, is exactly how they look when they get there, if they're in good shape with a really well-developed root system. And again, keeping that root system wet, I can't say that enough. It's very critical not to let those roots dry out. All right, so with your bare root stock, you really want to try and soak them overnight, but not longer than 24 hours, because remember what happens when tree roots sit in water for that long? Think back to that last class. Yep, they start to die. So too much water, bad thing. Too much air, a bad thing, right? Got to hit that in between mark. I would dig the hole while it's soaking. And you want to dig your hole wider, but at the same depth as the root length, right? And with bare root planting, you're going to kind of make a mound on the bottom of the planting hole, like you see right here, this mounded up area. And you set your roots and kind of drape them and shape them on top of that mound. And then you start to put, topsoil so they can spread on. You really only want to prune off broken branches or, crossing and rubbing branches, only defects, because it's going to need all those twigs with energy stored so that it can push back out. Remember, this thing's going to go into shock, so it needs all the energy it can get. And then step 3, you basically plant it at the same depth or slightly above. Here where we have a lot of clay soils, you're going to really want to plant that thing. I know it looks crazy, but you just kind of mound the dirt up over it, and then you create a bowl around the outside so that you can water, and the water kind of stays in that root area. But if you plant it too deep here in the south, the tree's going to end up, drowning, basically. And you're also covering that trunk, which you cannot cover the trunk. You have to make sure that that is not buried, or that traps moisture, and the next thing you know, the tree's rotting right there at the trunk. So tamp it in, don't step on it and mash it, because what happens to the airspace that was lovely created as you were settling this thing in? If you stamp on it with your feet, it's gone, right? You've compacted the soil. So you just need to hand tamp it in, really. And then fill your water, fill the basin. And then at the last, you fill over the top with some more topsoil if the soil settles, and it will as you water it. You add a little bit more topsoil. And that's it. And then, with the trees, if they're going to be in an area where they get a lot of wind load, you are probably going to want to stake them. And we'll go into supporting trees a little bit more. But, if they're taller than 8 feet bare root, which you don't get a lot, right? You don't get those huge tall trees bare root too often. But if you did, you definitely want to support that. It's not going to be able, it's going to be too heavy, good wind load, and it's going to go right over. If it's an area where it's not going to have a big wind load and it's very small, you probably don't need to stake it. But just kind of watch it. Check it over the next couple of days. If you see that it's been pushed over by a wind, well, then it's time to grab the stake and go ahead and stake it up. Okay? But just don't forget the stake. We'll get into that in a minute. I don't know why it's taking so long to load today. This is bizarre. Okay, so obviously we're going to go over planting bare root stock a little bit more. So like I said, this is kind of a picture of what it looks like. You make that mound and then you lay the roots out how you want it to grow into your hole that you've dug. And then keep the roots kind of closer to the surface. So these bare roots don't need to be planted deep, like I said. And just make sure that when you lay your roots out, none of them are circling. You don't have any girdling roots, right? Because that's not a pattern that we want the tree to continue. And also I'm going to add that you want to make sure that this outer layer is really broken up nicely, especially if you're in clay soils, because if not, if you don't scarify that edge of the pot, planting hole and break the soil up a little bit, it acts like a clay pot in a heavy clay soil. And the tree will hit that side and turn and then just start girdling itself. So that's what you want to avoid, okay? So make sure that they're not kinked and they're not starting to girdle when you lay those roots out. All right, containerized trees. Anyway, all right, so containerized or container grown trees. They're grown in soil or in a soil-less medium, right? It has a substrate of bark or compost or peat moss, perlite, vermiculite. They use all these mixes and potting soil mixes in the containers. You really always need to check the root system. That medium is very easy for those trees to move into. And so they have a tendency to hit the sides of the pot and do what? That's right, start turning and create girdling roots. So a good grower who's doing container pots will root prune his plants at least once, if not twice a year, to keep that from happening. But that's a really good grower. So I can't say there's a ton of those because most of the ones in pots I've gotten, I've had to really fight some girdling roots. Okay. And you're going to have to tease them apart or cut them if they're really bad. So that's what containerized trees are like. And here's a perfect example of those girdling roots I was talking about. All right, so this is, I mean, it is so densely matted in this thick, and you can see these roots are large. These aren't these tiny hair fiber roots. You know, they're in there too circling, but you know, these are some larger roots that we're going to need to probably cut. You are definitely going to need to take a rake and tease them out, because in a ball form like this, when I see this, I'm almost positive it's going to have where they've changed pot sizes. There's going to be interior roots that are girdling inside of this thick mass. You know, when it's this bad, a lot of times you end up just cutting off. You know, you cut off this donut at the bottom so that the tree can break apart a little bit, the root system can spread out, and then you're really almost cutting a ½ inch off this to get through some of this thick mass. This one in the center is not as bad. It can probably be teased apart with a good, you know, hand rake. Sometimes, you know, there's a combination tool that's a hand rake on one side and kind of a little spade or axe type structure on the other side, and you can use that to chop the thicker roots like these and really get the tines in there on the other side on the rake and just pull. You know, you're kind of smacking it. It looks terrible when you do it in the field. If anybody's watching you, they're like, "You're killing that poor tree." And I've actually had people say that in a planting demonstration. But, you know, give it a little torture now, and it's going to be a beautiful plant in about 3 years, as long as it's getting enough water and nutrient. You leave it like this, in about 3 years, it's dead. I'm not kidding. So keep that in mind. And always remember to look. When you see this dense mat, once you get that off and you tease those roots apart a little bit more, look for this. Because, like I said, an interior girdling root is going to do as much damage as these ones that are on the exterior. Okay, enough said about that. Container grown trees. Wow, what a plethora of things we have to put trees in. Yeah, sometimes they're in metal containers or pots or boxes, or, you know, there's grow bag mediums now. It's really interesting, all the different containers they come in, right? All right, so let's talk about a poor quality tree versus a good quality tree. Now, over here on this side, does anyone see a glaring problem with the size here? And I'm not just talking about the height. Look at the width of this this trunk mass, and the size of this pot. You think there might be girdling roots in there? I bet there are. So that may not be something you want. Not to mention this tree, good grief, it almost looks like it's been lion-tailed, you know? So you've got this giant trunk and this little poof at the ends. This is not excellent structure, really. On this side, it's a little better. Obviously, somebody's been taking care of these pots a little bit better. Again, is your leaf production really great? I mean, it's definitely all down the trunk, but that can also indicate what? When they're popping out these epicormic sprouts, right? So I'd really want to look and see what's going on in this root ball before I just flat out buy this tree. All right, so planting container trees. First, you're digging the hole first. Because remember, it's going to take you a minute to get that plant out of the pot and get it set up and all that. So if you're doing all that, and then you have to wait to dig the hole, what's happening to that root system? It's drying out, right? Unless you're keeping water on it. So, you know, I would dig your hole first, use your container to measure the depth, right? Then you're either going to cut the pot to get it out, and grabbing it by the trunk and yanking it out is not the way to do it. You can sever a critical root connection here at the base of the trunk when you do that. So never grab it by the trunk and yank. Bad idea. I've seen a lot of trees die because landscapers don't know that they shouldn't do that. So anyway, enough said about that. If you want, you can lay it on its side if you're trying to reuse the pot. And once you lay it on its side, you kind of have to roll it and mash on it to get the ball loosened up in that pot enough to slide it out of the pot, right? That's the only way you can do it. And then you're going to have to roll it or pick it up by the ball to put it into the hole. All right, so that's step one. Step two, you're laying it on its side. You're working on it now. You're cutting any of those girdling roots. You're loosening it up with the claw or hand rake. You're trying to leave as much of the root mass as you can intact. So you really only want to cut those girdling roots, right? And then you're sliding it into the hole and positioning it, making sure it's not too deep, right? That it's fitting in there well. And then you're starting to add your soil mix in and backfilling it. You know, I would fill it maybe, you know, halfway up, you know, kind of get it tied in there with your hands, not too much because you don't want to lose all that lovely airspace. then water it, let that settle because it's going to settle the dirt again, and then add the rest of it, right? And then at the top, you're going to add 2 to 3 inches of mulch when you're done with that, keeping it off the trunk by about 2 inches, right? Or let's go with the ISA version is 4 to 6 inches away from the flare of the trunk. Remember that, 4 to 6 inches away with the mulch. So let's stick with what they're showing you. And at least 2 to 3 inches depth of mulch. And then you're going to water weekly if you're not getting a rain event that's lasting more than a day. We have a tendency to get huge heavy rain events here in the Piedmont, but it only lasts like an hour to half an hour, and it rains so hard everything runs off. It doesn't get a chance to soak in. So unless it's one of those lovely slow soaking rains all day, you really probably are going to need to water it. Check that you're not overwatering is just my caution, especially if you're in an area with heavy clay soils. Okay. All right. Another thing to remember about planting with containers is take the doggone pot off the tree. Yes, people have done this. I mean, there is the black line, and when we got digging a little bit more on this, yeah, there was the pot. I mean, and you wonder why the tree is starting to not do well. Oh, you can't make this stuff up. Anyway, yeah, take the tree out. All right, balled and burlap trees. They're all so fun. Heavy as heck, but they're a lot of fun. All right, so they're up to 90% of the root system can be lost during the digging of the tree. Good grower who's doing balled burlap will make root prunes. Again, root prunes at least once or twice a year. And they'll do it usually, if they anticipate selling the tree, they'll definitely do it a month or 2 out from actually digging the tree. And that way they get a better root ball. But they don't all do that. So a lot of roots are lost when they're cutting that tree out of the dirt. They come with the root ball covered in burlap, placed in a wire basket, or on really large balls, they're drum laced. So that's placing up with rope for additional support. And they can move some pretty big doggone trees. You basically have to remove all that burlap covering the tree on the tops and the sides of the ball is best. If not, if you leave that, that creates a whole new problem we'll talk about in a minute. If you can get it all off there, that's even better. You got to remove all that twine and rope and strapping, all the tags and labels and flagging. There's all kinds of fun stuff on these ball and burlap trees. And then at last, you got to cut away the upper 1/3 of that basket, or 1/2 if you can get it, of the wire basket. Just get as much of it as you can is really best, to not leave any of that basket if you can help it. I'm lucky. I'm looking at my sites if they've gotten 1/3 of it removed. But yeah, getting as much as you can is really better. So here's what they look like. You got a big ball. This one is not in wire. It's wrapped with twine and burlap as they're tying it up. Usually this will either have rope or strapping around it so they can lift it by the ball. You would not want to lift this tree by the trunk because you're going to snap and break all the root connections here. It's just too heavy. And it usually does take 2 people or a piece of equipment to get these things, sometimes 3 if it's a big enough ball. And sometimes you can't move it without equipment, and that's all there is to it. So, all right, so the size of the root ball is based on tree caliper. So we don't say DBH when we're talking with new trees. We're talking about caliper. And you refer to American standards for nursery stock publications for the proper size relationships. So that would be the ANSI, ANSI, American National Standards Institute. Z60.1 is the publication. Caliper is measured at 6 inches above the ground line for trees less than 4 inches in diameter. Okay? And then for trees 12 inches or more than 4 inches in diameter. So you're measuring it at 12 inches for 4 inches in diameter and 6 inches above the ground for trees less than 4 inches in diameter. That makes sense. Width of the root ball should equal 10 to 12 inches in diameter per inch of trunk caliper. All right, so if you're dealing with a much smaller root ball, you know that you're probably not going to have enough roots, or there's a good likelihood that you're not going to have enough roots. So that's the formula, right? The width of the root ball equals 10 to 12 inches in diameter per 1 inch of trunk caliper. And that's how that goes. Excuse me. All right, transplanting. Oh, I love to see this going on. Transplanting a tree involves digging and prepping before moving. So they basically dig the hole and then go get the tree. But trees, that are hardened off are allowed to become acclimated to the cold or a new environment. So keep that in mind. Remember I said about underlined stuff? Trees that are hardened off are allowed to become acclimated to the cold or to a new environment. The best time to transplant a tree is early spring or in fall. I mean, again, it's going to depend on the type of tree and where you are as to the timing. So hardening off, we're going to talk about that a little bit more. It's a term used to refer to the process necessary for a plant to become acclimated to its environment. In the fall, trees begin to harden off or acclimate themselves to a harsh winter condition, right? So they're dropping leaves, they're preparing for all that. It begins with lower temperatures and shorter days. Deciduous trees and shrubs drop their leaves, they transfer their sap down to the roots, right? Fall and burlap trees are often dug, excuse me, in the fall, and then they're left to harden off over winter. That's what's going on here. They're stacked and left to harden off, right? They keep that root ball mulched. Either they heel them in, it's called heeling them in, or they're regularly irrigated. You'll see them out here with irrigation machines or sprinklers, or sometimes they're just hand watered. But that's what hardening off is all about. It's letting the tree acclimate to its environment. And this is an example on the side where they're prepping to cut a root and transport a tree. So they're down there, they dug it out. Now they're starting to use clippers to clip the root system, and then they'll scoop it out and wrap it up. But that's what it looks like. All right. So the time of planting, like I said, you want to do this when it's dormant. So checking where your area is for your dormant season. It has a lower metabolic rate when it's dormant. There's a lower transpiration rate. The temperatures are lower, which means it's not going to be releasing so much moisture, right? So there's less demand on the soil moisture, and it's less transplant shock when it's done during that time. And this picture, I love this picture off to the right. It gives you a good example of how the ball is lifted by the strapping. The strapping goes all the way around the ball, and then that's what you're using to pick it up on the machine. You're not using the trunk, right? You're using the strapping to pick it up. Okay. So you can imagine you're moving a tree this big in this photo, you better have your hole dug right. Because you don't want to have to replant and remove this a million times, right? And these can actually work. I'm always stunned that these trees can survive at this size. But like I said, the digging removes up to 95% of that root system. I mean, you can imagine that tree had a huge root system, right? And you're only giving it, right, maybe 10 to 15 feet from the trunk. Yeah, so 95% of your roots are gone. Dormant season is recommended, obviously, fall to spring. Root pruning before digging to increase root development in the balls. So remember, if you sever a root cleanly, it hardens off and then puts out new roots, right? Usually shoots to the left or right or up or down, depending on the soil it can move in. So if you prune it, root prune it before and give it a chance to do that, you're going to have more of those little advantageous roots, new roots coming out in that ball, so that it'll have a less difficult time when you transplant it into the ground, right? It's got more roots that'll be able to spread out. That's what root pruning does before digging the ball, to increase the root development in the ball. And also, if you've got a tree that's got big ganglious branches that will probably break during this process, you probably want to wrap and tie them before you get going. So tying up those branches keeps a lot of damage from happening, and they'll come that way a lot of times still wrapped up. So if you've ever bought ball and burlap, you know what I'm talking about. Transplanting with a tree spade. Golly, I have advocated for this a lot. It works really well here in our area. They have this giant spade that you see in these images, and each one of those little pieces that comes up forms a spade, and they basically open out. You know, like this one is set up apart. These are kind of closer together, but they open out, and then the blades go into the ground and literally just cut and pick up the tree all in one motion. So the roots don't dry out as quickly. You know, you water the ball really well before this is done. It actually works better when the soil is wet. And then they dig them out, take them to the place they've already dug the exact same hole size with this spade, and they drop it right into, they can position this, each one of these little spades moves independently, and the mechanics on the equipment allows it to shift the tree left, right, up, down, back, front in the hole as they're positioning it. So they're looking at it, they stop, they lower it, they're looking to see if the tree is straight and looking around all sides to make sure it's going in the ground in a good angle. And boom, the tree looks like it's been there its whole life. Once you've tamped it in, loosen the soil so that it can grow out into it, they're watering it, then they mulch over it, and it looks like the tree's been there forever. It's an amazing process, and it can really work well. But you have to really know what you're doing. They have to test underneath the soil to make sure there's no power lines. They can't do it if the tree is on top of power lines underground or gas lines, utility lines, water lines, sewer lines. So there can't be anything under the tree itself for them to be able to use this process. So just keep that in mind. All right, tree planting and establishment. So let's take a look at this, this little picture to 10 steps to properly plant a tree. All right, so you're gonna prune off any codominant leaders. You make sure you got one terminal at the top, one terminal leader, right? You don't want to cut that one. That is crucial. Got to have this guy or the tree doesn't grow right, right? So you might cut off this competitor, and there's your straighter one, you're leaving that. Crossing and rubbing branches, like I talked about, you prune that. It may not be necessary to stake or wrap the trunk, so you may or may not have to do that. Remove all those tags and labels. If your client wants to know, I won't remember what type tree you planted, what cultivar, give them the tag. But yeah, take those off, because if not, they'll end up growing into the trunk. Cut away the baling ropes or any ties. Remove the wire basket like we talked about. Widen and score that hole, especially if it's clay soils, but you really want to loosen it up so that we can move into that nice area with our root system as we're growing. Please remove the container, cut any circling roots, and remove as much of that burlap as you can. Leave your soil pedestal, leave it solid. Don't dig the hole deeper than the ball depth. And like I said, in clay soils, you might even want to come up a little higher. Better to plant, shallow than deep in a clay soil. Dig your hole 2 to 3 times the width of that root ball. It's a lot of digging involved on these. You got an area for water drainage or a pipe. If you're in really wet soils, you could install that before you drop the tree in the hole. Partially backfill, then water it and let it settle. Then let it, put some more soil in on top of that. You want unamended backfill, soil well to container water, right? You're building a little well to containerize the water in here. So that's why you pull that little lip up on the side. Here a lot of times we take the sod and just flip it over and start making our berm right there to keep the water in when it rains so that the tree gets the most benefit. Mulch, 2 to 3 inches depth. Keep it, how many? This says 2 to 3, but the other slide said 4 to 6, right? Prune off any of these little suckers that are coming off at the base. Prune out any broken branches. Prune narrow crotch angles, right? Because that's not going to be a good scenario as the tree gets bigger, right? So I would probably do away with this interior because it's eventually going to come up here and bash this, branch. So you only need one there, really. And again, don't prune that terminal leader. Okay. So I think that's enough said about all that.
Hey, Kay.
Yeah.
I do have a quick question from Stephen. What is the best way or best resource to test a location in order to figure out what species will best thrive in the natural conditions, like soil pH, moisture content, and soil mixture?
Yep. So do a soils test. Most of either the Forestry Service or I just lost what they're called now. Like UGA has them set up. You can send it to UGA on a soils test. Most of the counties have a county agent who will do soils testing. I know DeKalb has one, Gwinnett has one, and you can take your soils test there. They have little pre-done bags you can get from them to send your soil sample off to see what you're dealing with, first off. I also like to look at what's around it. Look what's there, what trees are doing well in that area. Maybe an area where the soil condition is sandy, it may be a loam, it may be a heavy clay, so all that's gonna determine what you want to plant. And like I said, I would not add anything to those soils unless you do a soils test and realize it's lacking in something. We'll get into fertilization on these trees in a minute, but Yeah, and the best rule of thumb is, if you look around and you see a species that's doing fairly well in an area with similar soils, you can bet that, that tree is going to do well there if you plant a new species of that. But in the name of diversity, you also want to look and see another tree that may be lacking in that area that would also do good in that soil type, just to get your diversity back. Remember what happens if our trees and forests are not diverse and we get a blight or a pest that attacks one specific thing, we lose the entire forest, right? So nature kind of mixes it up in there too, and we should follow that same pattern. I hope that answered it well enough. So planting and staking, let's go on to that. So this is just a detail. If you're working off of somebody else's plan that was approved by a county or municipality or whatever, they're going to have a detail that they want followed. A lot of us use the ISA detail, but there are others floating around out there. This is a good example of a detail showing you where it's supposed to be staked and how it's supposed to be tied, whether or not they're asking for a root wrap. A lot of places don't. I don't require one. If you're worried about people mowing with trimmers and getting in there and cutting that, there are better guards that you can put on rather than these trunk wraps that trap moisture. So I don't usually want those on trees I'm planting. We'll get into that in a minute too. But this is what this is. It's a planting detail that shows you how you're supposed to prep this whole thing and how you're supposed to put it in the ground. And some municipalities have their own. So you need to really check your tree ordinances to see if they require specific planting details. Okay. All right, so 10 steps for proper planting. So you're looking up for what? What may be overhead? Lights, wires, poles, utility lines. Dig your hole shallow and wide, not deep, right? Find the topmost root and treat any root defects you find. Place your tree in the hole and position the top root 1 to 3 inches within the top of the soil in that ball, right? Top root comes off the top of the tree. It's the first root up in the ground. Straighten the tree, so look at it from 2 angles. Straighten it, make sure it's going to grow straight like we want. Remove any synthetic materials, take off the ball and burlap, the strapping, all that stuff. Add backfill soil and firm that root ball in place, then water, right? Then add the rest of the soil. So add mulch, keep the mulch at least how many inches? 4 from the trunk. And then stake and prune the tree if needed. Now, you're looking at this tree they're giving you the example of. Would you say it's planted too deep? I would. But you notice it's got this red color at where it met the ball. That's how deep this was planted in the bag. In the ball bag, burlap. So it had been covered over with soil up to here. So you really want to unbury these things and find the root flare and find that first top root, right? Then you've not got all this excess soil that's going to do what? It's going to trap moisture and then the tree's going to die. But yeah, this is planted way too deep. And let me also state, once it's this deep, you can't just grab the trunk and yank it out. This person made the mistake of pulling out all the strapping and the burlap and everything else. Now they've got no way to lift this tree up really from this deep hole to add soil underneath, right? So what do you do in a situation like that? Well, I'm going to mention it because it's important. You see how he's got this shovel? You can turn it the other way and use it as a fulcrum, right? Use it as a lifter for you. So you're sliding that shovel up underneath the ball and you're kind of tilting the ball with the shovel, right? It may take 2 of you if it's a heavy enough ball. And then you've got a third person throwing dirt in there to lift it. And then you're going around to the other side and doing the same thing, right? That's really the only way you're going to be able to do it at this point. So I'm saying this to keep you from an extra step that really is a pain. And before you undo all the strapping, make sure your depth is correct, right? Because otherwise you're going to be stuck trying to hand work this in. So just keep that in mind, okay? All right, look up. This is your last chance to make sure you haven't put the tree in the wrong place. I can't say this enough. We don't want any tree monsters eating telephone wires. Come on, people. Now, we all know this is a formula for disaster, right? The tree's eventually going to do what? It's going to split, right? Because half the trunk's on one side and half the crown's on one side, half the crown's on the other. This is not a recipe for long-term growth. All right, so look up before you plant that tree and make sure that you pick the right tree for the place. If there's a wire there, hey, there are smaller trees that might do really well there, but certainly not oaks, right? Check if there's a wire, security light, building nearby, because if it's a tree that's going to spread canopy, what's going to happen? They're going to start pruning, and then it's going to be lopsided crown, and it's a nightmare. Right tree, right place. You know, put it elsewhere. Plant a small tree. Plant something columnar if it's near a building, so it's not going to spread out. Just look, you know, look up, look around. Okay. Again, looking around is important too. I bet when they planted this little oak tree all those years ago, they never in their wildest dreams imagined it would eat a fire hydrant, but it did. And same thing over here. You plant too close to the fence, and well, you know, it looks like the tree's munching on the fence, right? Well, it kind of is. And that is not a recipe for long-term growth, right? First wind event coming from that direction is going to probably snap off right there, right? Not a good scenario. So take into consideration any adjacent impacts for the tree as it gets older, because they not only grow up, they grow out, right? Parking lot perimeters are always challenges. We were talking about that root ball. Make sure you measure the distance from between the topmost of the root and the bottom of the root ball before you put it in the pot, and dig your hole to that measurement. You know, using the sticks is a great way to do it, so you don't have to drop it in there before you're ready. But like I said, keep that root ball moist. And obviously this guy hasn't done his root pruning right yet, I hope, because we still have what? We have sterling roots still, right? Anyway, like I said, dig your hole to about 90 to 95% of the depth of that root ball. And then you should be about right when you go to plant it. What techniques you can use. I was talking about finding that topmost root. Well, here's the perfect example. There is your root flare, and there is your topmost root. Okay. The point where the topmost root meets the trunk of the tree should be no more than 1 to 3 inches deep in the root ball or when planted. Remember, if they've added dirt over the top of this ball, and again, you can see the dirt level. So they had a good 3 to 4 inches of soil on top of this thing at one point, right? You got to clear all that off and get it down to the root flare, and then find with your hands that topmost root. So no more than 1 to 3 inches deep in the root ball or when planted. Root ball quality. Well, on the left is a good root ball. It's got lots of good roots. May have some girdling roots, but it's got a lot of good roots going out. On the right, you have not so much. You got a ton of excess soil, and you have poor root development in the ball itself, right? So look at the root ball, make sure that, you know, it's good. Too much soil is a bad thing and can be a poor quality root ball. You want that topmost root near the surface. And it's probably going to have a more of a root system if you're finding that right away.
Okay, you've got another question about that slide.
Oh, let me back up then.
Why do they add all the extra dirt? Moisture retention?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So the extra dirt gets added usually at the nursery when they're wrapping a ball and burlap tree. You got to think, they've just cut this thing. So they're kind of throwing a little dirt on top so that they can make that nice shape out of the root ball, right? And it's just something that happens in that process, you know, and I guess they figure, you know, over years and years of this happening, that's just the way they come now. It's not like they happen, and they're hardened off that way too, but that's where it happens, is at the nursery. And I think it's just a process of them digging that ball. Somehow the dirt gets popped over the top. And then as they go to tie, they're adding more to make that bundle nicer, you know, give it a little bracing. Some may add a little soil along the edges to keep the roots, you know, nice and tight. But yeah, it happens at the nursery. And it can happen in the pots too. In container trees, you can find the same thing. They've buried it too deep. So it's just a poor nursery practice. I wish I could say that it was something else, but it's not. That's what it is. So,
Okay.
yeah. All right, so that's why you're removing that excess soil like we talked about. 3 inches of soil and planting medium were removed from the top of this root ball. Like I said, it can happen in containers too. So you want to get rid of that. Use it as backfill into your, mix it into the backfill, that's fine. But make sure you find your root flare in your topmost root. Girdling roots, like I talked about, allowing stem girdling roots to remain causes major problems for the tree as it grows. It basically cuts its own circulation off. Remember me talking about that straw? Well, not only is poking holes in the straw allow it not to draw, but crimping it off allows it not to draw. So the tree kind of chokes itself. It can't draw water and nutrient. Once that root cuts into the trunk, it can no longer transport on that side of the tree. And that's what ends up killing them. Here's a perfect example. You can see the tree just basically kind of rotted, and you can see the circling roots inside of this thing. So it choked itself to death. That's really what happens. So make sure, it's critical that you get these roots that are circling cut. And the same from the interior. Remember, if this thing's been transferred in pot size, you may have hidden circling roots into that ball. Okay, treating root defects, cut or spread out any circling or kinked roots. If you can spread them out and save them, great. But if they're so bent that you can't move them, it's time to clip, right? So this circling root, if it's already formed this, you've got to clip it probably right here to keep it from circling anymore. You've got to get it past that bend. You got to come back behind that bend. I would probably come to right here where you have a nice little cageous root and just make your cut here. Find your topmost root, right? And then if these are not hardened, you might be able to spread those back out again, right? Just really check it. If it's too thick to cut, to move and bend, you're going to have to cut it. So spread them out as much as you can and try and save as much root as you can. And that's difficult on these container trees, but that's really the best you can do. Here's a good example of the top of the ball. That's your topped. That was their top root, and it was left above ground. And this kind of causes a problem, right? So now this poor thing has a circling root here. It's got crossing roots. It's, this is just not a great scenario. Really, the tree should have been buried above this top root, right? And then cut those girdling roots as they're going around and around and around. Circling roots, again, cut them, tear them so that you're using that rake and really ripping them so that they come out and you can tease them out. It's funny, it's like teasing hair back in the 50s, right? Well, now you're teasing roots. Yeah, and spread them out, and then they grow better. New roots grow pretty quickly into that backfill soil following root pruning. And that way, stem girdling roots are less likely to form, right? And advantageous roots are dying and replaced every day, so the tree is constantly putting those out. Like I said, remember, look for defects inside your root ball. By the time they tease, and this is what it looks like when you're done teasing these roots out. And look what they found in the process. Good grief, if you'd have left that, this tree would have been doomed, right? They're difficult to find and they're difficult to cut because of the depth in that root ball, but you got to do the best you can, right? Okay, circling roots often lead to leaning trees. Here's one that had a circling root, and it just doesn't spread out into the soil to give it the stability it needs either, and then a good wind hits it and over it goes. But this tree is not done for yet. You could still cut that root and, make sure it stays moist. Where's this mulch? Not in a good spot, right? It's right up against the trunk. So these folks need some help in making sure they get their mulch 4 inches from the trunk and cutting girdling roots. And then hopefully we can see if this tree survives. Also, this stuff can trap moisture against the trunk of the tree. And you can't leave it on indefinitely. That's, so they can come in here and mow. But it really has to be cut enough to where it's not going to start being pushed over by the tree. It's not going to trap moisture. It's not going to do all those things. This is not my favorite product to use if you're going to try and keep the weed eaters from hitting your trunk. Metal and plastic with holes is much better than this rib stuff with no holes. Just a side note. All right, lifting the tree, like I talked about, you're lifting it by the strap. It avoids damage when setting the tree in the hole. Lift it by the rope or the straps around the root ball, not by the trunk. Can't say that enough, not by the trunk. Putting your tree in the hole, that one's a little deep, not too bad. You can probably, take your shovel and lift that one like I talked about, like Fulcrum, and just lift that thing up and get some soil under it. Make sure it's straight in the hole. And again, You're not grabbing the trunk to shove it where it's straight, right? Because you're doing what? You're breaking that top root. We don't want to break that root collar right there. So you're lifting it from the base with shovels. And add some dirt, get it straight, but don't grab it and torque it and break that connection, because then the tree's just going to die. We talked about that too. If you don't have handy sticks to measure it, you can use your shovel. That's what this guy did. He used his shovel and measured the depth, and then he used his shovel to see where his tree was going to sit in the hole, right? So is this a little high? Might be. Most professionals agree it's better to plant a little high than too deeply, but you don't want to plant too high because that's not good either, right? When the topmost root is too deep in the ball, set the top of the ball several inches higher than the landscape soil to adjust. And that's what they're doing here. They're trying to figure out the best spot for the tree. Now you could plant it at this depth, but I would really bow out this bowl a lot bigger and kind of mound that dirt up, and then you want to make your ring around the tree to help trap moisture, because remember, your root ball mass is up here. Water is not going to run uphill, is it? No. So this would be a little bit high for me. I think I would drop it another inch or two. Unless, now this is something else to think about, he hasn't unwrapped this thing yet. So what's the likelihood this is all fill dirt? That might be the case too, right? And then that would be a good depth. If actually where his shovel is where the topmost root is, then that would be a good depth to plant this tree. So it's all stuff to keep in mind, right? Okay, so obviously, like I said, we are too deep here. We're going to have to use the shovels, lift this thing up, and put more soil under it. So measure that and get it right before you drop it in the hole and take the strapping off. All right, this tree is planted correctly. Yay! It's at a good height, right? I don't see any circling roots. That's a good thing. The other one, yeah, you're going to be using that shovel a lot, pal. So don't get it too deep. Oh, it's a lot of work. I speak from experience from when I was young. Anyway, the effects of planting depth on stress. So position primary roots 1 to 3 inches below grade. Excess soil over the root ball intercepts water meant for the roots and causes them to dry out, right? So we don't want a bunch of soil over the top of the root ball. Here they've used string. They've just done a bunch of stuff wrong in this image, right? They left the string, they left the strapping, they left all that stuff. They put mulch right up against the trunk. The ball is too deep. This is a perfect example of what not to do, right? The tree is not going to do well if it lives at all, which it probably won't. Anyway, enough said. Straightening the tree, make sure before you add that final backfill that the tree is straight. Look at it from 2 different perpendicular directions, right? Because it may be straight this way, but you walk over and look at it the other way and it's leaning, right? So 2 different directions, 2 different perpendicular directions. Make sure the tree is straight. Remove the burlap, okay? Remove it, cut as much of it off as you can. Some people will roll it down. I don't really like that method myself. I like it cut as much as you can get. And then whatever you can't get off, kind of push it as far down into that hole as you can get it, right? And there's a reason for that. Synthetic burlap, you can tell the difference between synthetic burlap and regular burlap, real burlap, because the synthetic melts into a plastic goo when you hit it with a lighter, while real burlap flames up and turns to ash. That's how you tell the difference. You just tear a little piece off and hold a lighter to it and see what happens, right? If it's synthetic, you need to make sure you get all of it with a pruner or a knife or another sharp blade. And the reason you want to make sure you get all of it is because synthetic burlap allows roots to grow through, but here's the rub. They're weak right where they've pushed through. They can't really continue to spread, so they easily break off. This is not a good recipe if there's a good wind event, right? They're just going to snap. They're not going to hold the tree up like it's supposed to. So get that synthetic stuff off the tree. And really, if you're not going to take the time to test it, get the burlap off, push the rest of it into the base of the hole. You know, that's the thing. If you're not going to test it, don't leave anywhere the roots are going to come back out of the ball. And that's, that's the main thing. Oh, one more thing. Let me talk about burlap altogether. So the other problem with burlap whether it's synthetic or real. If you don't take that stuff off, not only do you have a problem with the roots, but it's going to act like a wick, okay? It's going to wick moisture right up to the top of the soil surface. So whatever moisture that tree is getting is now being wicked away by this burlap or the strapping or the rope or the twine. It all acts like a wick and draws that moisture off. So keep that in mind. You've got to remove that stuff. Okay, baskets. You can see what happened here. Whoops, we left the basket on. Now we have a tree that's grown through this basket and it's, you know, it's not unwell. Obviously it's dead now because they had to pull it out of the ground. Baskets are made from heavy gauge wire, often used to help keep the ball intact during shipping and handling. But you really got to cut that basket off, fold it down. Cutting it is easier, you know, when you're planting it before you cover it over. And then you're adding your backfill. Like I said, I'd get it to about here and then add water, let it settle, and then you're filling over the rest of the backfill. And then notice, again, every picture, you can see the depth. This poor tree had soil over the top, and here's that topmost root, right? That's what we want to see, you know, before you plant this thing. Now, as you're planting it, not only are you backfilling the sides, but you are going to want to cover this with a little soil too. Because what happens if you don't cover it over with a little soil? Right, it dries out. That's not good either. And then you're mulching, right? 4 inches from the trunk. You don't want that mulch closer than 4 inches to the trunk. And not too much dirt either. You know, I wouldn't go more than an inch, inch and a half, or a half an inch to an inch. No more than that. Loose. I would not compact the soil on top of this ball. I wouldn't even pat it down. All right, cutting into your backfill. Once you've got it in there, you got to loosen that backfill material up, because if not, what's going to happen, like I talked about, especially in clay soils, it's going to act like the side of a pot, and the tree is going to hit it and turn, and you're starting the pattern for a girdling root, right? So put your shovel in the ground and break up that edge so that the tree can move into that soil, right? And it enlarges the hole and it pushes a little backfill into the hole. That's fine, but you're loosening up the material that it's going to grow into. Moderately pack the backfill. Remember, don't take your big size 12s and step that stuff down till it can't move. Sorry, I've seen that happen too. As you've now compressed the soil and compacted the soil, and what's the tree going to do? It's probably going to die, especially in clay soils. Anyway, enough said. Yeah, there we go. Water it in, let it settle. Fertilization. Now, I told you we were going to talk about this. Not recommended. What's the first word it says? Fertilization at planting. Not recommended. Fertilizing at planting time is not likely going to improve the survivability or growth. It might offer a very small benefit in poor soils. Nitrogen may stimulate some root growth with proper watering, but usually people use the wrong type of stuff and they end up burning the roots. Soluble fertilizers would burn roots if too much is applied, which kills the tree, and that's why it's not recommended. If you've got to do something, if the soil's that poor, use only a slow release fertilizer. Okay, so it's not recommended. And if you have to, because the soil is so poor, only a slow release fertilizer. All right. Add mulch. Hey, mulch, 2 to 4 inches. Organic is the best. Rubber mulch is not. I'm just going to throw that in there. Rubber mulch will superheat your trees, so don't use rubber mulch. Organic mulch, at least 6 feet in diameter, around 1 to 2 inch caliper tree, right? Again, you're keeping that mulch where? How many inches off that trunk? 4 to 6 inches off the trunk. Wider is better than deeper as far as mulch is concerned. I wouldn't go more than 2 to 4 inches because it has a tendency to trap the moisture right at the soil surface and not let the moisture go all the way down to the roots. That's why you don't want too much mulch. Don't use black plastic under the mulch. What's plastic do? It keeps moisture out, right? But not a good idea. Don't put down plastic under your mulch. You don't need it. You're trying to make the soil active, not choke it out. Don't allow mulch to build up, so we're not creating those horrible mulch volcanoes. And keep the mulch away from the trunk. Again, 4 to 6 inches away from the trunk.
Okay, someone asked for a clarification of what exactly does putting mulch too close to the trunk do?
Ah, putting mulch too close to the trunk traps moisture against the trunk of the tree. The moisture allows pests, funguses, and everything else to infiltrate that bark, and it will kill the tree. I've seen it happen. We'll get into that in just a second, but that's what happens. It traps moisture, which allows pests and fungi into the tree. Not the good fungi either.
Thanks.
Sure, no problem. Oh, speaking of fungi, I'll tell you guys my joke. A mushroom walks into a bar. That's funny in itself. And he walks up to the bartender and says, hey, I'd like to order a drink. And the bartender says, we don't serve your kind here, pal. And he says, what? I'm a fungi. Sorry, I digress. So anyway, improper mulching. If the turf grass grows too close to the tree, trees perform poorly. Why? Because the turf and weeds rob trees of moisture and nutrients. Some produce chemicals that inhibit tree growth, right? We have that allelopathic chemical warfare going on between plants. And lawn mowing equipment damages the trunk. They got to get in there and mow that stuff, right? So, if you don't have enough mulch, all the weeds and grass are going to grow up. And then there's more of the likelihood that they're going to come in there with the weed eaters, like I said, and the weeds and mulch basically rob the tree of what it needs because their root system sits over the top of the tree's root system, right? So they get all the stuff first. They're getting all the nutrients, they're getting all the water first, and the tree is suffering. So not enough mulch, not a good thing. Too much mulch, not a good thing. All right, here we're talking about the mulch and proper mulching. Like I said, never pile it like a volcano. It cuts off oxygen to the roots. It can keep irrigation and rainwater out, like I said, too deep and the water can't get through. It keeps roots too wet in poor drain soils like our clays. And stem girdling roots can also result on some trees if it's over mulched. Usually it's like maples and stuff that put their roots up high, and they're going to be up high and hit that mulch and turn. Not a good thing. Anyway, staking and guying. Let's get into that a little bit. Support is not always necessary. Use it only if the tree needs it. In other words, you see it starting to push over in the wind. They can be detrimental to tree development. The tree needs to be able to move, right? And that's how it builds strength in this wood, right? And it also creates a bigger, thicker root net. So if I can't move in my trunk, I become rigid and may snap in the wind a bit, right? If I am not able to move, my roots think, oh, well, I'm big enough to hold this up. It's not moving. Right? That's not good either. On windy sites, you definitely probably want to use staking and guying, especially for large conifers or bare root trees. Remember we talked about that? Or where vandalism or mechanical injury may occur. Some of those stakes can actually help, them getting in there. And trees that are planted on slopes, that's another instance where you may need a little help holding the tree up. Trees can become injured and girdled from staking and guying materials if they're improperly installed or not removed in a timely manner, or they're removed improperly. That can screw the tree up too. So you want to really make sure you're watching in this staking and guying. You don't want to leave them on too long. You really only want to leave them on long enough for the tree to establish its root system and get firm in that soil. The perfect example, you can put the best staking and guying system on and nobody remembers to take it off. And here are the 3 little tubes that the, staking and guying has been eaten by the tree as it's gotten bigger, So you've got to remember to take stuff off, please. Traditional staking methods, most of these require removal within 1 year of planting. I don't even like to leave them on that long. A month or 2 is really all I like to leave them on, but you don't want to leave them beyond a year. That's the bottom line. No longer than a year. You want them off that thing before it's a year old, or a year after you plant. There's a lot of different kinds. There's rubber or flexible material. The stakes go into the ground to hold it in place. Other ones go stakes wide and then they're in, or you can stake right across the root ball and then perpendicular in that last image. Horizontal to the tree. It keeps it, keeps it up. But all of them are going to limit the trunk movement, right? So you don't want to leave them on long. Use 1 to 3 stakes. Guying material should be wide, smooth, non-abrasive, because the tree is going to move, right? And you don't want it scraping the bark. Flexible and photodegradable. What does that mean? Photodegradable means it breaks down in the light. So if you might forget it, which hopefully you or your client won't, it will start to degrade and the tree can break it apart. but we want it off before that happens. But they suggest that it be photodegradable. Stakes placed in the upwind side of the tree gives a little bit more stability, and it should allow for movement of the tree. So you don't want to trap the tree where it can't move at all. You just want it held loosely enough that if there's a really big wind, it's not going to push it over. You want the tree to be able to move, to develop that strong root ball and the strong response wood as it gets bigger. And like I said, remove it within a year of planting. Guying, use a wire for larger trees of 4-inch diameter. Use 3 to 4 guy wires or straps around the tree. Secure the guy wires and straps into the ground with anchors or stakes. There's land anchors, there's dead men, there's 100 different varieties. Hoses is not recommended, okay? That used to be the old school way. We don't do that. Oh, my internet's okay. Well, hopefully it looks like it's fixed itself. So, and again, remove within a year of planting. Remove within a year of planting. Tree wraps, all right? They're not really recommended for newly planted trees. Tree wraps is what you're seeing on the top when you're wrapping the trunk. Again, it creates a temperature variant. It can make it really hot or really cold. It holds moisture. It provides shelter for those horrible little insects that get in there and do damage to your tree. It's just not recommended. Tree wraps are not recommended for new trees. Plastic or metal mesh guards installed around the trunk to help minimize damage from animals and mowers, those aren't as bad. They sit off the trunk. You don't want them pressed right up against the trunk of the tree. It should be on loosely enough to where it's not going to inhibit the tree movement or growth, and it's not going to trap moisture against the trunk, remember? But it does help with the mowers and dogs or whatever, okay? So there's that. Pruning should be limited. Again, we talked about only pruning broken branches, structural pruning to train the tree early in its life between 1 to 3 years and establish that nice, straight central leader, well-spaced, balanced branches and attached limbs. Don't prune to compensate for root loss. This used to be something you hear about, oh, you lost a bunch of roots, you should take some limbs off to compensate. No, forget that. The energy is stored in these roots, in these twigs and branches. We don't want to prune them off because it's going to need that energy to be able to survive transplant shock. Okay? Planting specifications, detailed plans and statements of procedures and standards. We talked about the details and the standards. You should have something like that before you plant, especially look to see if your jurisdiction requires it. Written, make sure it's written out before in your work bid, before you start, right? So you're writing out what you're going to do and how you're going to plant it and all that for your client in your bid. Define your key terms. Clearly define what a healthy tree is or a vigorous tree if you're stating that. What does that mean exactly? You know, list it out. Establish timelines for each step of the installation. We're going to dig the hole. We're going to take it out of the pot. We're going to do a root prune. We're going to then put it at that. So you're setting that up. Include follow-up maintenance. The tree's going to need water. You're going to have to make sure somebody waters that. They can either pay you to do it or someone else. And I would do periodic inspections in the first 3 years to see how the tree's doing, right? Define the length of terms of any warranties you may provide. Say, I'll be checking this tree for a year, or I give it 2 years warranty after I plant it. And remember, you're going to want to spec that you're doing the maintenance, because if it dies because your client said, oh, I'll water it, and they signed to that, and it dies because of no water, well, that shouldn't be something you're paying for, right? So all that needs to be specced out in your agreement, in your bid and your written work detail. Define the length and term of your warranty, like I said, and then utilize American standards for nursery stock, the ANSI Z60.1. That's your nursery stock standard, okay? To specify your tree quality. And that is that. Hopefully I answered all the questions.
Chapter 8 is about pruning. So everything that we've discussed from a biological standpoint and a health standpoint, things like that, are now going to come into play. We're going to begin the look into what happens when you prune a tree, how to prune the tree, what are the standards for pruning, all that sort of things. And again, I want to refer back to all of you. It would be worth your while to visit the TCIA web page and purchase these extra manuals. So the A300s are broken down into the main standard, and then I'll get my laser going. So this is the main standard, and then it's broken down into all these supplemental parts. Part one is the pruning standard. So whatever you get from TCI is going to be the most up-to-date information that will likely show up on the exam. So we're going to talk about pruning objectives, how trees are going to respond to that pruning process. Again, we'll get into branch morphology and why that's important in the pruning process, and what it means about intentional wounding and what kind of decay we might produce from that. We'll talk about pruning techniques, and we'll also talk about pruning palm trees, my favorite subject. No. So pruning is the most common tree maintenance procedure that's done. By far the most common activity performed by a tree care company is removal. But when it comes to a maintenance, pruning is the most common maintenance procedure performed by a tree care company or by homeowners. It's done to maintain safety, improve tree structure and health, satisfy customer goals, and have an impact on the tree's aesthetics, the way that it looks. Arborists need to understand the biology and the basic requirements of trees to prune for optimal tree health, safety, and structure. Removing foliage from a tree by pruning it removes a couple of things. One, it's going to remove the stored starches. Remember how we have all of that extra photosynthate that's created, it's stored away in the xylem, the older xylem tissue, as well as flowing about in the current xylem tissue. So if you're pruning off live leaf-bearing area, you're also pruning off stored starch reserves. You're also reducing the photosynthetic capacity of that canopy. And because you're making a smaller tree, remember you're pruning something off, so you are making a smaller tree, you have less area for new growth to appear on. Also, pruning is going to chemically change a future growth. We'll talk about how that happens as well. You can also initiate shoot invigoration and some other things by pruning. So again, the basic standard here that we all should be using, this is the American National Standards Institute A300 pruning specifications. Where did these standards come from? There used to be an organization that was called the NAA, the National Arborist Association, and it was put into play so that we as arborists could be uniquely identified as an industry and not grouped together with forestry and logging practices. So we lobbied Congress for a long time trying to get that a separate designation because our insurance rates were very, very high. Our work comp and things like that were very high in our industry, still are to this day. But these are the specifications that were developed to send to Congress by the NAA. The NAA no longer is in existence. It's actually morphed into the TCIA, the Tree Care Industry Association, and they still continue to lobby Congress for changes in the ANSI standards and the OSHA requirements for our industry. One of the things that they try to accomplish doing this is standardizing what we do, so that when we say we're going to canopy thinning, canopy cleaning, all these things that we'll get into in a little while are standardized. So if you're in the industry, you should incorporate these into your work orders. If you are on the other side, if you're purchasing or buying from us to perform for your municipality, your pruning specifications that everybody bids on should also reference the pruning standards here in the A300s, and don't just say something like prune to ANSI A300 specifications. You'll need to be very specific in which part of the specification that you intend to have performed on your street trees or park trees. So we want to have a very clear reason for pruning. When it comes down to a tree, the tree by itself out in the woods has been doing just fine for millions of years. And why do we even have to prune them to begin with? Trees seem to get along just fine. They're able to fruit and pass along their genetic material to other generations, which is, is what we all are trying to do. So we need to have a reason for pruning. What's our objective? Are we trying, because now we're talking about a tree in somebody's front yard, not one that's out in the forest. So we've taken a tree that should have been out in the forest, put it in as sort of a synthetic environment with people, and now we have some inherent liability as an association with having done that. So we might want to reduce the potential of branch failure, say on a Bradford pear that has that profusion of branches from a very small area on the trunk. So if those branches are pruned or thinned out at a very young age, and intensive maintenance and management done to that tree in the first 3 or 4 years, then all likelihood that Bradford pear that would normally blow apart in 12 years can now all of a sudden live to be 100 years old without issue. So we would have pruned it to decrease branch failure potential. We might want to provide clearance over sidewalks or over streets or around playground equipment, or you might even want to be able to mow under it. We might want to reduce the shade that's cast by the tree so that the turf underneath will perform a little better. We might want to change how it presents itself to the wind. We might want to change the wind resistance by pruning. Maintaining health. A lot of our new cultivars, these are sort of man-made trees, or they were discovered to have a certain look or appearance to them that we found favorable. Sometimes these have very dense canopies. And take a dogwood that you would purchase from a nursery, has a pretty dense canopy compared to a dogwood you would find out in the forest. And why is this? It's because they found that with that dense canopy, it can survive fairly well in a heavy sun environment. It can shut down the external canopy and switch to an internal canopy, so that it doesn't burn up during the heat and direct sunlight of the day. But some of these plants, we put that same dogwood on the edge of the forest, it might get too much. It might not get enough sunlight penetrating the interior canopy, and so it's not going to function as well. So if we prune some of that out, thin some of it out, we'll get better airflow, better light penetration, and the dew that forms on the leaves in the morning will dissipate much earlier in the day. You might also prune to influence flower or fruit production. Think about crepe myrtles or fruit trees, apples and peaches and that sort of thing. We might also prune just to improve a view. Think about trees in the mountains or along a golf course where a homeowner might want to be able to see through to a vista somewhere. Also, we might want to just improve the overall aesthetics. We might want the tree to have a little more formal shape to it, something like that. Consider tree growth and development and the effects of pruning over the long term. These trees, if managed properly, live much longer than we do. So an improper pruning on a tree that's going to live to be 200 years old back when it's 60 is going to be a significant impact. It's going to significantly shorten that tree's life. Take that into account. Now, we also need to understand that branch attachment, the morphology, what does it look like? Tree biology and compartmentalization play a big role in pruning, in minimizing the impact that is going to be initiated by the pruning process. We want to identify the branch collar. Look for the forms when the branch remains relatively small in diameter compared to the stem. We're going to form that branch collar. Overlapping wood is strong and forms a unique barrier called the branch protection zone. So again, remind yourself of what we went over back in the tree biology section and what that branch protection zone means. It's sort of an area that's packed with a lot of chemicals that are going to help retard the development of decay fungi It can also help to limit borer infestations and things like that. And so if you're making the pruning cuts inside of the branch protection zone, you're going to have good compartmentalization. If it's outside of that, decay can become much more significant. Codominant stems, these are when the two stems are fairly equal in size to each other. Remember back to all those the pictures have included bark when we were talking about cabling and that sort of thing. So codominants usually do not produce a branch collar, but they do have sort of, you will see a rise where the two come together, but those aren't really joined. We'll see some of that in a minute. This bark that's crushed in between the two codominant leads is referred to as included bark. Let's take a quick look at the branch bark ridge, the branch collar, when or where to actually make the cut. So if you remember back to our tree biology section, this area that's right in here is going to be, so really the branch protection zone is going to be in this area. This is where those chemicals are really going to be packed in there. So remember that this area that's swollen from here, this sort of swollen area, that's the branch collar. And we don't want to cut this collar. This collar is a combination of trunk material as well as limb material. And so we want to avoid damaging any of the trunk material. The branch bark ridge, we talked about how this forms over time. So if we went back here, this is the diameter of the tree that it would have been at the time when the branch first sprouted out. So this sort of cone or the root of this branch goes down inside of the main trunk, sort of like this. And that would be our potential of decay if we made the proper pruning cut. So again, here you can see that if we made this cut, it would cut off this collar, or cut into the collar. If we cut too far out, say we left a stub out here, then we're getting away from the branch protection zone. We're getting away from where those response chemicals are stored. So we want to optimize those two. So we want to get as close as we can to the branch collar without actually cutting the collar. Here's this is what we call a strong union. So there's a branch collar here. There's no included bark in this structure. So this is a U-shaped formation. So branches will usually have they form three types of branch attachments. You'll see this one that's nice and U-shaped, such as on this crepe myrtle. This is a very strong union. Then you'll see included bark, and this happens when the two are fairly equal in diameter, like this. And so on one side, the bark might go inward like this, and on the other side, it might protrude outward a little. So this one is a V, and these are referred to as V-shaped. So there's U-shaped and V-shaped. Like I said, there's two different types of V-shaped formations. There's one like this where the bark really goes in towards the tree. So the real connection point between these two leaders is way down here. There's no connection between the two leaders, even though it looks like there's really not. Here's probably a lacebark elm or some type of cultivar elm. This is fairly common in that species, especially the multi-trunk varieties where there's lots of codominants. Here you can see some lighter colored wood. That lighter color comes as a response. That's response growth. So this is probably actually starting to split apart, but this would be an outward seam. So this is an inward seam and this is an outward seam. It's kind of hard to tell in these pictures the difference, and you don't have to know the difference for the exam. But this type of inclusion, so the V-shaped always has inclusion, the U-shaped does not have inclusion of bark. So now we're going to talk about the different types of cuts that are made. We'll start with the thinning cut. The preferred place to prune is back to the parent branch or trunk. So we're gonna cut off something smaller compared to the diameter of its parent. So we're gonna remove this section. So it becomes a thinning cut. So the cuts should be made just to the outside of the branch collar, as we talked about it a minute ago. Pruning outside of the branch collar closely stimulates where branches would naturally shed. So if that branch were to die, it's going to die back to that branch collar typically. Cut should be smooth and not jagged. You want that final cut to be absolutely as pristine as possible in order to stimulate the callus growth. So here's a live oak that was, this is planted in my front yard, and the freeze basically destroyed it. So I did some pruning experiments on it. But here we have, you can see that this branch is growing just straight up the canopy. So this is one that, and it's much smaller than the main trunk. So this would be an example of a thinning cut. But if we were to let this grow, as this branch grows in diameter and the trunk grows in diameter, this would become included bark over time. So I'm going to go ahead and eliminate that before it becomes a problem. You can also have crossing and rubbing branches. So here's a branch that comes out in a little more open angle, but it's still not the best angle. You can already see some inclusion happening here. Then you have a branch that comes straight off the side of the tree. So we would prefer to have this one that comes straight off the side of the tree. We'd like for this one to remain because it's a nice open U-shaped attachment. So we would prefer to take this branch off and leave this one. So if we eliminate these early in a tree's life, it's much better in the long run. So unlike reduction cuts, thinning cuts will target the branch collar. Now the branch collar here is actually somewhere down here, but you really can't make that cut without damaging the parent stem. So we get as close as we can to it with a slight angle on it that sort of mimics the angle of the branch collar. You know, here is the other cut. After that rubbing branch has been removed, you can still see there was a little bit of included bark starting to form there. So here, again, the branch collar is going to be down here and just not possible to get close enough to it. So again, thinning cuts are the removal of lateral branches back to a larger parent branch or trunk. Looks like we might have a question popping up here.
Yeah, it looks like Sam says, where do you make a pruning cut on V-shaped, or do you dominate branches?
Yes, on the V-shape, this is what I'm showing in both of these examples. These were the V-shaped with included bark. So you simply get as close as you can to the branch collar without damaging the parent.
Cool. Thanks, Rob.
You bet. So the other type of primary pruning cut that we make is referred to as a reduction cut. So we have thinning cuts that we talked about before, and then a reduction cut. Trees do not compartmentalize a wound on a lateral branch as well as they do on the parent branch. And that's because of that branch protection zone again. The ability of the tree to compartmentalize the wound is a function of the size of the cut, the vigor and species of the tree, and the climate. It's important to consider the ability of the remaining branch to sustain itself and assume apical dominance. So the smaller the cuts that you make, the easier it is for the tree to close over it, and the less significant of a photosynthetic contributor that branch likely was. So the smaller, the better. So in the case of a reduction cut, you know, we might have a branch that extends out over a walkway somewhere, and we don't want it poking us in the eye. We don't want to take off the whole branch, so we might want to perform this reduction cut. So here I'm taking off, this would be the parent branch coming out like this, but I'm pruning it back to a smaller branch. So this is an example of the reduction cut. So you can think about it, I'm reducing the length of the branch, you know, and here's the final result. So you can see here would have been the branch collar for this one. And then you can see a little branch bark ridge right there under the laser pointer. And then here's my final cut. And again, this was done with a pair of hand pruners. So this is a relatively small cut. Everybody always asks, well, where do I make this cut? So if you thought about the angle that's produced between this branch bark ridge and this branch collar, you just want to rotate that angle around and make it on the parent branch outside of branch bark ridge. You don't want to damage that branch bark ridge either. But I want to get fairly close to it. So there might be some protective chemicals that are generated by this branch protection zone. And since it's a really small diameter cut, this cut's about the size of a pencil. It's going to close over fairly easily. This branch that I've left is going to become the primary apical meristem for that branch. So that's going to be the new branch tip that controls the development. So there's plenty of chemical in this size branch that's coming back down this branch to feed information to the rest of the parent branch. So that's how it will establish that apical dominance. So here's a pictorial example of a reduction cut and a thinning cut. So again, the reduction cut is going to take off the larger piece and leave the smaller piece. So you're reducing the length of the branch. The thinning cut is just the opposite. The actual length of the branch most of the time is going to be the same length. You're going to prune off something that at the point of pruning is smaller in diameter than the parent branch. Another type of cut is called a heading cut. It involves cutting limbs to a stub, a bud, or a lateral branch not large enough to assume apical dominance. It's often used on very small plants and shrubs to stimulate branching. Again, the smaller the diameter of the pruning cut, the easier it is for the plant to overcome the impact from that pruning episode. So if you have a very small shrub, crepe myrtle, or very small crepe myrtles, or small boxwoods, or azaleas, things like that, they can tolerate it when the diameter is fairly small, and it'll easily overcome it. Heading cuts used in topping is never an appropriate thing to do. So this is an inappropriate technique. And so topping usually refers to what happens on larger trees if you do a heading cut. Early intervention can help prevent problematic decay issues. Again, remember, when we have an objective, our first objective is, what's this tree going to look like in the future? How do we need to prune it in order to achieve our goal? We can't always do that, especially with urban sprawl. We might be building homes in areas that have very large mature trees, and these branches might protrude out over into the roadways, which we can't really tolerate because the UPS truck or Amazon delivery truck might hit them and break them off. So we want to prune them so that breakage doesn't happen. However, on these large trees, they do not have the same ability to compartmentalize or to develop callus tissue to close off a wound. So here we have all kinds of just nastiness. This was probably storm damage. At least that's what I'm going to say it is, because I hope a company wouldn't make cuts this big. So if you look at the diameter of these cuts, this is pretty big. This was pretty big. This was fairly significant in size. So 50 to 60% of the photosynthetic capacity of this tree was pruned off in whatever happened here. If it was a pruning episode, they pruned off way too much. So it's going to create these decay columns on the inside, which will lead to a hazard, meaning you probably should have just removed the tree, especially if you consider the species, and the species is one that does not compartmentalize well. Its response mechanism is to put on a bunch of growth, but this is already a mature tree, so a bunch of growth is kind of out of the question. So if this was pruning, if it was done when the tree was quite small, then these cuts wouldn't have had to have been so big. Here's another example of some heading cuts. These are just sort of indiscriminate, so remember that they're These can be cut back just to a bud. Sometimes they're just internodal cuts. They're not cutting back to anything at all. And this does a lot of damage to the tree. Recall back to biology. What do those apical meristems do? They produce those auxins. Those auxins are what communicates to the rest of the plant to say, hey, I'm in charge. Everybody else slow down. I'm controlling the energy output. I'm controlling what the starch demand on the reserves in the old xylem tissue might be, that sort of thing. So if you take all this stuff off, you're also taking off a bunch of wood that used to come up here that formed the canopy, and that wood stored starches. So if you cut all this stuff off, all of a sudden you are creating an energy deficit. I have nothing left here that was going to produce photosynthate. I'm going to have to rely on that flush of growth in the spring and hope that it's enough to sustain the demands of all of this sink. Remember, sink and source, the source being leaves, everything else being a sink. We can, because we have removed all those auxins, there's, we call it shock. You can also, when you go into shock and you have a lack of energy, you're going to open yourself up to diseases and insect problems. Some plants, such as the oaks here in Texas, are attracted to pruning cuts. That nididulid beetle, the one that spreads oak wilt, would just love something like this because there's lots of sap that runs out. Dogwood borers are attracted to pruning cuts as well. So, these would just be great. It's like, hey, here's a free buffet. Come and get it. The future growth that's going to happen is going to be epicormic growth or sucker growth or water sprouts, whatever you want to call them. And these have that very weak form of attachment. They're likely to grow straight up towards the sunlight. So the angle between the parent stem and the new growth is going to be very tight. You're going to get a lot of rapid new growths, which is also going to require an expenditure of energy. So you're going to have to go on these local energy reserves in order to push up this new growth. Because remember, energy from way down here is not going to travel up to here to push more growth out. So whatever energy is going to be left right around this pruning area is what it's going to need to push out that new growth. If you cut it back too far or too often, it can result in tree death. It looks kind of unnatural, and you're paying for a removal twice, because something like this is just as expensive as having, or you could even be more expensive than just removing the plant altogether. So let's talk about some of the physicality parts of pruning. How are we going to do this? Remember, I said I want that final cut to be absolutely as pristine as possible. I want the bark fully attached to the xylem tissue. It needs to be nice and firm. So in the picture, you can see that this is a very well done pruning cut. The bark layer and the cambio layer are still touching each other. So this is very much intact all the way around. I don't see any branch collar material in here. This is all limb material. We can see that we're pretty close to the trunk, so it must have done an excellent job of making this prune. So how do we get this last cut to be pristine? Well, we need to be able to handle the limb that's out here easily enough so that when we make this final cut, the weight of the branch out here is not impacting how well we can make this final cut. So we use a 3-cut method or a 3-step method. Step 1, make an undercut out from the final cut. Now this is saying about 12 inches from the trunk. So, and everybody says, is this a hard and fast rule? So the bigger the branch is in diameter, the further out from the trunk you want to be. So a 12-inch top cut might be on a branch that's something about this big around. The second cut you make on top, slightly further out on the branch. And once you make these 2 cuts, then you can just reach up, grab the branch and pop it off. And so now all of this weight that's out here is gone, and you're just left with a stub that's from here to the to the final cut area. So you can easily hold this with one hand and use a handsaw to finish this part off. So remove the stub with final cut, being careful not to cut flush against the trunk. Leave the collar intact. So again, here's my tree out in the front yard. Here's that branch that was growing straight up. I made my undercut first. You can see the undercut, then the top cut I made second. There's a little top cut. You can see kind of light through that cut. Reached up, grabbed the top part of this branch and pulled in this direction, and that snaps off. So you can see where there's a little bottom part goes up and over. So that's how the branch actually separates. So that's the first two cuts of the 3-cut method. So again, here's some sort of different angles so that you can see what that snap cut does. So you want that top cut and the bottom cut to overlap just a little bit so that when you pull on it, that it snaps this part of what's left right here. So now I have this very small piece left to work with, and it's easy enough to get this nice smooth final cut at an appropriate angle, close enough to the branch collar as I can get without damaging that parent material. Also, by doing this cut, this branch that's over here, this one still has a nice U shape to it. So as this branch grows in diameter and this one grows in diameter, it's not going to form that included bark where this one would have. So that's why this one was pruned out and this branch remained. So you want to avoid that flush cut. Flush cut is what they call it when you cut into the branch collar. Here you can see this sort of different color of wood at the top, and this is part of the branch collar that they cut into. And you can see this sort of jagged look to this where the bark has pulled away from the cambium a little bit. And this happens quite frequently, especially if you're rushing through the cut. If you're cutting through here as fast as you can and you get to this part, this final little pull of your pull saw can easily separate these two. The springtime, the early spring, when the sap first starts moving and the tree's trying to make that decision to jump over to the new growth increment, the new vascular system for the year, the layer between the bark and the cambium becomes much more pliable and much easier to damage. This is why we would rather do winter pruning or midsummer pruning, depending on the tree species, rather than do spring or fall pruning. But this happens mostly in the springtime with that final pull of the pull saw. And so this is over time. This is not the exact same branch, obviously, but this is what happens. If you cut into that branch collar, you're not going to get the callus material forming as well. And then down here where the bark was separated from the cambium, here this stuff's probably going to happen way down here somewhere, and you just can't see it yet because the damage from the pruning cut pulled back a half an inch or so towards the trunk. So the bigger the limbs get, obviously, the heavier it gets. You might need things like roping and rigging out there because you don't want to peel or crush the bark as you're removing it. You know, if this branch had been large in diameter, it could have weighed several hundred pounds. But this one's a small branch, so it's something I could do all by hand. But larger branches, even a foot section like a 20-inch diameter live oak branch that's a foot long might weigh several hundred pounds per foot of length. Live oak is a very dense wood, so you have to take all that into account. How am I going to make that final cut? So your top cut and your bottom cut might have to go further out the branch in order to keep so you don't make the cuts overlap or you get it too close to the trunk, as all that weight comes off of the tree. Because here, remember in the other one, I pulled the branch to make that snap cut. when you talk about larger branches, you're using the weight of the branch itself to make that snap cut. So you make that bottom cut, and then when you begin the top cut, as you bypass that bottom cut, it's going to snap off by itself just from the weight of the branch. So take that into consideration. And again, you're still using the same 3-cut method. You just need to account for these much larger weights, lengths, and the dangers involved. You can have just a 1-cut method, like the little reduction cut that I made, and you saw my hand pruners in there. That would be a 1-step cut. So it's just whenever the weights get to the point where you could risk doing damage to the main trunk, that's when you want to use that 3-step method. So now we're going to talk about the different types of structural pruning. Structural pruning is what we want to do to establish good scaffolding in the canopy. Think of a tree over time. You have to be able to visualize what you're doing to the tree over, as we said, some of these trees can live 200 years. There's going to be some branches that are temporary, some branches that are permanent, some branches that might need to be directionally pruned, and the symmetry involved might need to be impacted as well. So scaffold pruning or structural pruning is to establish that strong scaffolding system on the inside. It's used to prune young trees or trees that have not been pruned in many years. Trees that have been structurally pruned are less likely to fail and require less maintenance later on. The 5 steps to structural pruning. First, you want to remove all the broken, dead, dying, diseased, or damaged branches. So you want to take out everything that shouldn't have been there to begin with, things that are obviously a high risk if you leave it, or if it's dead, or if there's some disease in it. Go ahead and prune that stuff out first before you start to talk about which leader you're going to select as your dominant leader or where your permanent branches are going to start. So get away all of the clutter. This is kind of like cleaning your desk before you begin a project. Get rid of all the stuff that shouldn't be there. And then you're going to analyze what's left in order to visualize that structural scaffolding that you want to have left. So after you take out all of that, select and establish a dominant leader. So some trees will develop competing leads in the top of the canopy, and you want to be able to prune them so that you can establish just one of those as the primary central leader. The next thing that you want to do is select the lowest permanent branch. And we'll sort of beat this up a little bit as to what that means, but basically it means that if you're over a sidewalk, 8 feet is probably going to be your lowest permanent branch. So when you first plant a tree and your tree's only 8 feet tall, there's probably not a permanent branch on that tree at that point. So scaffolding is not an issue at that point. You just want lots of good photosynthetic capacity, but you still want to go ahead at that young age and begin to establish that dominant leader. On these little taller trees, then you're going to start selecting the scaffold branching after you select the permanent branch, the branch structure. Then you want to start to look for things like branch spacing. Is there enough room in between the branches so that they can grow in secondary development? And the trunk can grow in secondary development so that over time they're not going to interfere with each other. And then lastly, select the temporary branches. So like I said, on that young tree that's only 8 or 9 feet tall, that really doesn't even have a permanent branch yet, all those branches are going to be thought of as temporary branches, but you still might want to prune away from a sidewalk or elevate a little bit to allow a mower to operate underneath it, even though you're still going to have temporary branches above that height. So here's a tree that's a little larger. This is still considered a young tree. This is 20, 25 years of age on a tree that could live to be 150, 160 years of age. So it's still relatively, this is a young tree. So here's this tree before pruning. And notice there's already a little bit of a brush pile generated over here as our pruner is up in the canopy. And there are sort of multiple tops. This guy is competing for height over here. Inside of this canopy, there's probably some other leaders that are competing for that apical dominance. So what we did from a pruning standpoint is we went ahead and isolated a single central leader, so which required pruning off some of these that were right here. And then this other branch that came way up here is now gone. So this one's gone altogether. So it was pruned way back here somewhere. So this is a great way to establish that central leader, so you can clearly see how that comes all the way down. We have our lowest permanent, these are probably permanent branches in this situation, because here we have a sidewalk and not a street, little bike parking area, and then some park area over to the side. So we can easily mow around this. It's not going to hit a cyclist in the head or a walker in the head as they go by. The branches are evenly spaced as you go up, so you can sort of see that internal structure, or the skeleton of the tree, the scaffold branches that are there after pruning. So notice that this is fairly vigorous pruning. A lot was taken out of this young tree, but it's still in the tolerable volume of loss for that young tree. So that structural pruning, select the leader for the primary terminal shoot of the trunk. The permanent branches are branches that will be left in place, often forming the initial scaffold framework of the tree. And scaffold branches are the permanent or structural branches of the tree, and they should be well spaced. So some other reasons for structural pruning that pop up. So this is probably a Zelkova. This is not my original artwork, so I do not know, but this is a Zelkova. This is their growth habit. There's a lot of internal branch structure here, but it has this very nice V shape to it. And that's why these are often chosen for streetways, for planters, because here they don't have to do any pruning to expose the Wells Fargo sign over here, and they don't have to do any pruning on the street side to keep it off of the buses or UPS or Amazon guy. So really, there's not a whole lot of structural pruning that can be done. Take into account the tree species. These trees do not have a super long lifespan. They do not fail quite as rapidly as the Bradford pear does. So really, there's not a lot of structural pruning to be done. But if you wanted to try to open this up some, you certainly could, but you can see it'd be difficult to do pruning in there. Here's another tree that has been pruned. It still has this somewhat of a vase-shaped appearance to it, but it was pruned to have this vase shape. So there were branches that came off like this, and branches that came off over into the street. So this is an intersection and a walkway. This is at a mall somewhere. So we wanted to get it up and out of pedestrians and out and away from people coming in and out of this parking garage. So you prune mature trees differently than you would prune these young trees that we've talked about so far. And the older a tree gets, the less tolerant it becomes of pruning, and much less tolerant it is of large limb removal. So the factors to think about here include the site, the time of year that you're pruning, the species, the size, growth habit, vitality, and the overall maturity. Mature trees are less tolerant of pruning than young trees. And by less tolerant, that basically means that you cannot prune the same volume out of a mature tree that you could out of one of those young trees. Mature trees, if they had maintenance pruning done on them or structural pruning done on them early in their lifespan, they should require very little routine pruning, maybe just deadwood removal. By the point you get to a mature tree, structural pruning is kind of out of the picture. Never remove more than 1/4 of a tree's leaf-bearing capacity. So remember, you're not pruning off 1/4 the length of a branch. It's just where the leaves are out on the branch. So that's where you start measuring the length of the branch out to the branch tip. That's the photosynthetic or the leaf bearing portion of the branch. You're not supposed to remove more than 1/4 of that in a pruning episode. In a very young tree, you could get by with up to 66%. So these pruning numbers have gone all over the place. When I started in this industry 30 years ago, the standard was that you could remove up to 66% of the canopy. Where do you think that came from? Remember, trees produce a lot of photosynthate, so much photosynthate that they store about 66% of it. So what the thought was back then was, well, it only needs 1/3 of the leaf bearing capacity to satisfy itself, which is sort of true, but there's no buffer. There's no extra energy for storage, defense, for fruiting structures and all that sort of thing. So then they decided, well, we're going to change that from 66% to 33%. That way we'll have this nice buffer. So don't remove more than 33% of the leaf bearing canopy. And now they've decided, well, maybe that's even too much. And now it's down to 1/4 of the tree's leaf bearing canopy. So limit pruning to the removal of dead branches, structural defects, and utility clearance in the case of mature trees. Here's a before and after on a mature tree. Notice there's not a heck of a lot of change here. This is a little bit thinner, but really they just removed a few of the crossing and rubbing branches here, maybe opened up the interior just a little bit for better view of how these branch unions are made. There are some, like I said, there were some thinning cuts that were done in here, but not many. So again, this would have been dead branches, serious structural defects, or utility clearance. There was no utility clearance that went on here. Okay, so earlier I talked about that ANSI A300 Part 1 specification and how we can use that to describe a bid process or describe what your company is going to do for the owner of that tree. So we would all like to be able to use these terms, and that's what we should strive for. So crown cleaning. This is the selective removal of water sprouts, dead, dying, disease, crossing, and hazardous branches from a tree. So remember when we were talking about the structural pruning, the first thing that we wanted to do was to get everything that shouldn't be there out of the way. That's basically what's happening here in crown cleaning. The next thing is crown thinning. So this includes, these stack on top of each other. So you have crown cleaning. So if you're doing crown thinning, you're also going to do crown cleaning. In crown thinning, this includes also the removal of selected branches to increase light penetration, air movement through the crown, and to reduce weight. It might also incorporate that structural pruning at this point. So thinning, you're going to take off a little more. So your objective for crown thinning is going to be a little different from crown cleaning. Always define the maximum or minimum branch diameter to be removed in each type of this pruning episode. I mean, if you think about some of the large water oaks that you might see in metro Atlanta, they have a ton of deadwood up in them. So much so that if you put a climber up there and you said to remove water sprouts, dead, dying, and diseased, crossing, and hazardous branches from a tree, a climber might be up there all day. And so that it might cost $4,000 or $5,000 to put a team on a tree for an entire day to get all of that little meticulous deadwood out. However, if in the contract you said crown cleaning, deadwood 2 inches in diameter and larger, or 3 inches in diameter or larger, so you're going to only go after deadwood that's like this or larger. The insurance institutes have determined that branches that are 2 inches and larger in diameter are large enough that if they were to fall out of a tree, could do damage to person and or property. So that's why you would typically focus your pruning on 2 inch and larger. However, if it's just massive amounts of deadwood in the canopy, you might want to increase that number, or if it's out in a park setting, you might increase that number larger than 2 inches. And again, crown thinning, you might not want to remove branches any larger than a certain diameter. You could say 2 to 5 inch or ½ inch or 1 inch to 2 inch diameter only, something like that when it comes to the removal of live branches. And again, that would help you focus on the age of the plant and doing the best type of pruning. If you're reducing weight on the branch, that should probably be specifically explained on a work order. crown raising. So this is where you're really not doing anything else in the tree, but elevating the tree from the base up so that you can see under the tree or clear it for a stop sign or something like that. And you would define it as some specific height, crown raising. Elevate crown for a final elevation of 8 feet above grade by the trunk. So, your branches will come off of the tree and then some of them will dip down like this. So you could also say crown raising, branch tips for a final height of 8 feet from the ground. So that's going to be different than from the trunk. So you'll have to explain where your height needs to be measured from the ground, where you would like your final crown to be. Vista pruning is a selective removal or reduction of scaffold limbs to allow a specific view. So vista pruning usually incorporates a larger pruning cut for a more permanent solution to gain a specific view. Like up in the mountains, like up at Big Canoe or something like that, you might have a client that says, I want to be able to see Mount Yona in the background. Can you just top this tree? And you would say, well, no, we can't do topping. However, we might have a better solution for you. Vista pruning might be an appropriate method. So there might be some way to strike a balance between what the homeowner wants and what the tree can deal with from a removal standpoint. Crown reduction is used to reduce the size of a tree or branch. The remaining lateral branch should be at least 1/3 the diameter of the removed portion. Here we go with this 1/3 business again. So again, you're coming back to something that's at least 1/3 the diameter of the portion removed. So in this situation, when you're doing this reduction pruning, here you're taking off that 66% and leaving 33% of the diameter of the branch diameter. So on these smaller cuts, it can easily overcome that loss still. On a large mature tree, this crown reduction is not really something that you want to do. We are now starting to study things like retrenchment pruning, but it has not become part of the standard yet. So retrenchment pruning has a lot to do with crown reduction on very mature trees. But again, it's still in the study process, so you will not see that on your exam. Crown restoration is used to improve structure and appearance. It's usually done over several years. After I worked in Colorado for a number of years and lived out there when they had one of the worst ice storms in the city's history, it damaged 85% or more of all the trees in town. And so most of it was tip damage, limb breakage, splits, and things like that. So we went in over several years and pruned those trees to try to reestablish a structural scaffold system to those. You don't have to solve all the problems at once. Remember, leave enough canopy on the tree for the tree to survive. And utility pruning. This is the pruning around or near utility facilities with the objective of maintaining a safe and reliable utility service. Utility pruning, the specifications can be a certain distance from the branch. From the power line, not the branch. So, if it's one run that's let's say 250 kV, then your pruning distance is going to be 10 feet or more. If it's a higher amount of voltage, then the distance away from the line is going to be more and more. So that needs to be specified in the bid. Also, utility pruning. Utilities are a special entity in the U.S. government. Utilities and railways can operate like nothing else operates in this country. So utilities can get by with internodal cutting. So just cutting off randomly, I'm going to go exactly 10 feet away from the power line and make that cut. Until you get into a major metropolitan area, then they are required to follow the guidelines that we've discussed so far with proper pruning. So railways are the same way. They can cut right back to their right-of-way line indiscriminately. Yes.
Just wanted to break for a moment. Do you mind if we take a 5-minute breather?
Sure. Perfect.
All right, awesome. I'm not going to switch screens or anything because it'll take about that much time to get it reset. So everybody, I'll just give you a 1-minute verbal warning when we're ready to pick back up.
Okay.
Thank you.
You bet.
One-minute warning, everybody, before we get started. All right. Thanks, everybody. Hope you've made it back to your seats. Rob, it is back to you to pick up.
All right.
Thank
All right. So we're going to move on to maintaining tree health through pruning. So this is just some examples of what might happen. So here's a stub cut, so this was made well outside of that branch protection zone. Notice that it did die back to the branch collar, but all of this stub material was a host for this pathogen. Some pathogens are easier to compartmentalize than others, but if this had been a bad pathogen, it could easily have gone into the rest of the trunk. An example might be something like hypoxylin. So if hypoxylin were to establish out here on this dying branch stub, that hypoxylin could easily get into the rest of the main trunk. So it'd be best to have gone ahead and removed it all the way back to the branch collar if possible. Sometimes you might want to get something out of the tree. Mistletoe is a true parasite. This parasite puts down its root system into the vascular tissue of the plant and drinks on water like nobody's business. It's like, hey, there's all the water I want here. So it just starts sucking up all the water and thrives. Even knocking this mistletoe off with a pruning, with a pole pruner or something like that, is just going to grow right back from that root system. There really are no good chemical control methods. There's nothing that you can really spray on it or do to mistletoe to make it go away. And its root system extends quite a distance below. So on this branch, to get rid of the mistletoe on that branch, you'd have to come down and prune it all the way back to the parent in this area. Some of the mistletoe might actually be on the main trunk, in which case you'd have to prune it below wherever that attack is to get rid of it. And then whenever you have these crossing and rubbing branches, like on this maple, again, if these two twigs were to grow in diameter over time, they're going to rub on each other. And as they do so, they're going to rub the bark away, those protective layers above the cambium, and eventually they'll do cambial damage in a non-branch protection zone area, and then you're going to introduce decay. So go ahead and prune one of these out before that becomes an issue. So let's talk about that crown reduction a little bit. You might want to create a smaller tree. You might want that vista over the top here for some reason, but for some reason you want a smaller tree. So here's a great example of good pruning. This diagram comes to us from, I believe, Dr. Ed Gilman down at the University of Florida. He has produced several small booklets about pruning, both establishment pruning, crown reduction pruning, structural pruning, all those. He has little handouts that you can get from the university website. And so that might be something you'd also want to look at. And so all the dashed lines in here, these are what's being removed. All the hard tree that you see in here is to remain. Notice there's some thinning cuts in here as well as reduction cuts. So you're reducing the overall height of the tree. You're bringing it back to something that can still support apical dominance. In each of these cases, you're supporting that dominance. Sometimes you're just pruning all the way back to the main trunk. So again, crown reduction can be a combination of thinning cuts and reduction cuts. You want to so keep branches less than half the diameter of the trunk. So refer back to the actual manual here. A little while ago, we referenced that 1/4 of the diameter. You remember I said it had a lot to do with the branch diameter as to what you can get by with. So look it up in your book and see what the reduction cut limitation is, to see if it's you can take off 66% and leave 33%. What they're telling us in this slide is that it should be half or less. So in some cases, you might want to change the canopy density to allow sunlight penetration. You might want grass to grow and that sort of thing. Think about this as your long-term objective. It would probably be better to have a big mulch bed under here rather than having turf grow all the way up to the trunk so that you would not have to make big cuts like this. Remember earlier I said how difficult it is to handle these large cuts, and because they're very heavy and they have a tendency to peel. This is exactly what happened here. You can see this peel below the cut, so not a very well performed cut. Here's a guy out here doing some thinning cuts to try to reduce the density of this canopy. So you saw this picture from a slightly different angle during Kay's presentation when she was talking about where to plant. So these are two great examples of where not to plant your trees. So this is a live oak in this little small, 4x4 foot cutout. Just think that the mature diameter of this trunk is over 72 inches. So just the trunk itself is going to be way out here in the sidewalk. So you're setting it up for damage in that direction. And these things can get about 75 to 85 feet tall. So obviously you're going to, if it's already in the power lines and or the utility lines here, it's obviously always going to be in them, and you might require some type of pruning. Over in Atlanta in the Brookwood Hills subdivision, if you drive through there, you'll see lots of trees that look like this, and they were actually pruned to do that over a very long period of time. And so it wasn't like they just went in and cut out a couple of big leaders and left big giant wounds in here. All the pruning cuts that were done on them were fairly small over time, and you got these good U-shaped formations. Again, this was sort of experimental work that we did, and they showed very little storm damage in their lifetime. We monitored these trees for almost 40 years now, and they're still doing quite nicely. But in this case, they just went in and cut, made these big gaping wounds on here. As we've seen, you don't want to make very many of those large cuts like that in mature trees. So here's another discussion about the temporary versus the permanent branch management here. So in this case, we're over a street, and all the branches on this side, on the street side, are considered temporary at this point, 13, 14 feet up, and you're still hitting the trucks over here. So eventually all those branches on that side so won't be retained until you get up here. On the sidewalk side, however, we might have some permanent branches here at about the 8-foot level. Here's another hands-on. This is back to that tree that I've been whacking on in the front yard. So all of the branches from here down are temporary branches, and this is measured at 6 feet. So this is 6 feet off the ground. I'm about 6 feet tall, so I want to be able to mow under my tree without worrying about it. So I measured from the ground up along the trunk and then removed those branches from that point down. So it did a couple of things for me. One, it allowed me to sit in my office. I'm sitting right there looking out the window at this tree right now. So I can now see the street and know when people are pulling up to my house. So that might be a safety issue that you want to see out of the windows, or you want people from the street to be able to see the home. But my main objective here was to get around with the lawnmower. Here's the 3 different life stages of a tree. You've got something, it says newly planted, but this is a pretty big tree for a newly planted tree. But again, if these trees are all the same tree, you're just looking at it over time. At this height, there really is no permanent branch yet. So all of these are considered temporary pruning. So you might just do something here to encourage that strong central leader to keep developing, so that you don't have these secondary leaders start to take over. 5 to 10 years down the line, when we're starting to get some permanent canopy up here. So we want to be very careful about how we stagger the branches here so that we get this good scaffold branching on the tree. It's going to be with the tree for the rest of its life. These temporary branches, you might start to do some tip reduction pruning on these. And what that will do is it will help to encourage a more well-defined branch collar and a heavier duty branch protection zone, so that when these do finally come off, they'll be good to go. Another place that this can be done is up in the canopy. Again, when we're trying to single out one of these for the primary canopy, for the primary leader up here, we might want to do what's called subordination pruning. So if you have two stems that are fairly equal in size and diameter, we might want to begin this type of shortening procedure on just one of those. So instead of taking off the whole branch all the way back to the tree, especially when they're younger like this, because you'd be taking off a lot of the photosynthetic capacity, we might want to retain some of that, but we want to change it chemically. So this is where pruning can have this positive impact. So you might have these co-dominant leads. If you begin to reduce one of them, you're going to encourage the development of a branch collar. So there might not be one there at the moment, but by doing the reduction pruning over several years, you are going to develop eventually a branch collar. And then when it comes time to prune it off, you'll have a branch collar to prune it back to with good compartmentalization. Now, here's some poor pruning techniques or practices. I'm sure you've been, and this happens a lot on golf courses and areas with beautiful views, mountains, oceans, things like that. They will over prune the heck out of these trees in a process called lion tailing. This is when you're stripping off everything off of the branch and just leaving sort of a pom-pom out at the tip. If you think about a lion's tail, it has pretty smooth fur until you get out there to the end, and then you have this puff of hair out at the end. So that's where it gets its name from. This is removing way too much of the interior. You're going to get, well, we'll talk about what happens in a minute. Clearing too much foliage can cause the production of water sprouts. So again, anytime you're doing some pruning, you're going to impact that tree. If you take off too much of the photosynthetic capacity of the tree says, hey, I'm not making enough energy. It's time to activate those latent buds. Think back to the biology section when we talked about those latent buds that just hung out there. Those things are undifferentiated meristematic points, would be its official name, but adventitious or suppressed buds is another. So that's going to stimulate all those to go ahead and become a branch and produce these water sprouts so that it can put on more canopy to get back to the amount of photosynthate that it needs. Topping is a bad practice. We've talked about the reasons that's not good. Internodal pruning is a cut that's not pruned back to a lateral. So this is just sort of lopped off. Remember, it's just indiscriminate would be an internodal. Internodal pruning would be sort of a topping, but on a smaller level. Here's a closer look at what happens in a lion's tailing event. Here, the canopy's all way out at the branch tips. They've taken off. There's some huge cuts that they made on the inside. And then you can see all of the thinning cuts that they made in here, and then stripping off some of the smaller foliage all the way out to the tips. So energy is produced out here and it moves downstream and down the trunk. But is this enough remaining photosynthetic capacity to sustain all of this branch? Here they've taken off well over 50% of the photosynthetic bearing portion of the canopy. So what our standards tell us is that this would definitely throw the tree into some shock. It's not manufacturing enough energy to stay alive. Once this is done, it's very difficult to restore. You used to have all of these nice branch attachments, nice U-shaped branch attachments. Anything that comes back on the interior is now going to be that water sprout or that adventitious growth, and it's going to be growing straight up. So if you have a branch that's fairly upward and then you have straight up shoots coming off of it, that branch angle, the new branch angle, is going to be very tight. You're also going to want to go through and probably remove some of those, which is going to add more damage. They're all going to occur along the top side of the branch, and so pruning off on the top side of the branch is going to cause problems as well. Why topping is bad. We've sort of gone over this: starvation, shock, insect disease, weak limb formation when it grows back, rapid new growth will lead to a tree death if it's done on the wrong species of tree. It can be pretty ugly and it can cost a lot. Some more reasons here that wasn't clear enough that it's ugly. Here's some other ones that are pretty darn ugly. You can see these going down the street. Just hideous plant material. So now let's talk a little about palm pruning. So fronds are large divided leaves, and they are some of the largest leaves in the tree world. They can be very heavy. Remove dead fronds from the top down. Do not remove live, healthy fronds. So when you're pruning these, you see this poor guy here. He's on. This is horrible pruning practice here. You can see he's standing on spikes. So he's has climbed the tree wearing spikes. So everywhere he climbed the tree, he was injuring the trunk, injuring that vascular tissue. Remember, they don't have secondary growth. The amount of vascular tissue is fixed. So every bit of damage overall could contribute to the decline if you damage enough of that tissue. He is pruning it from the bottom up instead of from the top down. He's pruned off way more of the canopy than what's needed. You know, somebody probably said, I want to be able to see the harbor in the background, so I want you to really over prune it. But this is horrible for the health of the plant. It just can't make enough photosynthate to stay alive. Even those branches that begin to turn yellow. So in a palm tree, you have that center spike that goes up. If you remember the morphology of the palm, so you have that center spike. Then you have the current year's growth out here. Then maybe a year or so older out here, and then another year or so out here, and then another year sort of facing downward. So the ones that sort of hang down and are brown, those are totally dead. Those next level up that might have some yellow to it, they are actually storing magnesium as well as a few other beneficial micronutrients. So it's preferable not to prune those off either. And then you have the green ones that are going to be outward and sort of upward. And then you have that center spike. So really the only thing you should prune off is that bottom dead material, and you start at the top and prune like this to prune it off, because again, it is very heavy. It accumulates a bunch of stuff. So if you were to cut some of the support off, if you were to start at the bottom and work your way up, you could cut off a branch that's supporting several hundred pounds of dead biomass above it, so it can break off and land in your lap. It can do things like break your leg, it can dislocate your hip, it could cut your climbing line, it can do all kinds of nasty stuff. So be sure that you're not pruning it like is shown in the picture here. Live fronds should only be removed if they're becoming loose or they're dangerous. Sever close to the petiole base without damaging the living trunk tissue. Again, when you look at these, you're going to be able to see where it comes off to form that frond, where it splits and comes out to a single piece. That's the petiole, and that's where you can make that cut. And then it'll die back to where it needs to against the trunk. Another type of specialty pruning is espalier. This is a technique that allows the plant to grow in a single plane. So it's sort of a one-dimensional appearance to the plant. So it has this nice central leader to it, well-spaced, intentional scaffold branching. You know, this can be done with apples and pears and a number of other plant types out there. So, but that it is a special technique that's done to produce a plant that either grows on a wall or just grow in one plane. Pollarding is another type of specialty pruning. It is perfectly acceptable type of pruning. Trees, if it's done properly, the trees can live this way for a very long time. It's a technique that's used on large maturing trees that result in the development of callus at the cut ends of the branch. We actually start doing pollarding when the trees are young, so you don't really have to start at a mature tree. It's typically started on a much younger tree. Internodal cuts is how you would initiate it. So you make an internodal cut. I know it's not what you want to do, right? But you're just doing it this one time. You're making this internodal cut, and that begins the pollarding process. If you cut it back to that exact same spot every year, it begins to form a fistule. And that fistule becomes the place that stores the majority of that 66% of leftover energy, gets stored in that fist. And so when you prune back to that fist or that knob, it can use the energy stored there for the next year's growth. So here's some examples of pollarding. This is a very common practice over in Europe. Came about the young growth that you could get to very close to the ground every year was pretty good for feeding cattle before the turfs came, before the grasses would come in. So they would feed some of this to cattle. They would also use this in the silkworm industry on certain species of trees. They would prune them to look like this. But you can see these sort of fistules that are out here, and they're pruning back to that fist every year. Same over here. I think these were London plane trees. So they're pruned back, which is, if you've seen a sycamore, it's very similar to a sycamore. So they're pruning back to the same place. I've seen places like this in Italy where you'll drive for 10 or 15 miles and see trees that were pruned just like this. In the springtime and in the summer, it looks pretty awesome. You have these very symmetrical trees. It's pretty cool looking, but in the winter, you see this. So not quite so attractive, but it does not injure the overall health. Some of these trees that were been pruned like this, some of these are documented at being well over 200 years of age, and they've been doing this since the trees were very young. So it did not impact the overall longevity of the tree. It does not lead to massive decay columns or anything that you think would happen. We hear a lot about, injuring the crepe myrtles and over pruning crepe myrtles, but this started as a practice of pollarding. So you would make these sort of fists there. And again, you'd have no decay columns associated with it. There's plenty of energy for next year's growth, development, and flowering. But this is very labor intensive. Think about these trees. Look at all the sprouts that have come up from those fistules. You'd have to get in there by hand using small hand pruners and literally prune each one of those off. It takes a very long time to do. So it's labor intensive. 30, 45 years ago, people would do that to their crepe myrtles and maintain that pollarding. But then we started hiring people that did not know what they were doing, and they would come in and say, man, that's too much work. I'm just going to cut that off. It's the same look when I'm done, right? So then they really just started hacking away at them, and now that's more of a common practice to hack them off indiscriminately every year, which does form decay columns. It does injure the cambium. It does deplete them of energy and all that. So know the difference between just what happens when you're topping and what happens when you're pollarding. Pollarding is an ISA approved methodology for pruning. Wound dressings. So these have been found not to be beneficial. These are compounds that are applied to tree wounds or cuts for cosmetic reasons. And again, this is primarily, there are uses for wound dressings, but we used to think that we would limit decay. So we would put these wound dressings on so you wouldn't develop a decay column. That's why they started using wound dressings 600 years ago. But what studies have found out is that you paint this black tar on there, and it absorbs heat, traps moisture, makes it very dark on the inside. What does that sound like? It sounds like an incubator to me. So it actually accelerates decay behind where that stuff was applied. So modern wound dressings are used primarily for insect disease and pathogen control. Here in central Texas, if you're pruning live oaks, you have to spray the cut of the live oak with something that's going to persist for at least 2 weeks so that it traps that moisture behind the paint, and the nididulid beetle, which transfers the oak wilt, won't come up and give your tree oak wilt. You do not have to use the tar-based paints or anything like that. Any type of sealant will work. So I typically recommend latex paint because it wears off in a year or so and flakes off and goes away. It's not very permanent. So you really just have to coat it long enough for the tree to fully compartmentalize off the pruning area so that it doesn't weep. Studies have not shown any beneficial effect in wound callousing. So there are some wound dressings out there that are hormone based that will accelerate callousing as well as adventitious growth, but you really don't. Again, you don't need those. Like I said, it can be used to reduce borer attacks on, say, dogwoods or oak wilt infections or control sprout production. You can also have these hormones that limit sprout production, but that also inhibits callus development. Here's some pruning tools out there. What should you know about them? They should be in very good repair. They should be very sharp, very clean. Between job sites, you need to spray them down with Lysol so that you kill off any viral activity or bacterial activity that can reside on the teeth of your pruning saws or chainsaws, or any of that should all be disinfected between properties. If you're pruning trees with problems, you can even prune it between each tree. If you're doing something like fire blight within a single tree, you have to spray between every single cut, sterilize your equipment between every single cut. You make sure that if you are using pruners, that they are the bypass type and not the anvil type of pruner. Anvil pruners, you have a base and a blade, and the blade comes down and traps here's the branch, here's the base or the anvil and the pruning tool, and here's the sharp part that comes down to cut it. Well, what you're doing is you're crushing the leftover cut on the anvil, so that does a lot of damage. So when do you prune? Growth is maximized if pruning is done just before bud swell in late winter or early spring, February and March. Pruning when trees are dormant allows the tree a full growing season to close and compartmentalize the wound. Again, remember that this is an international exam, so don't get too caught up on when's best for pruning in your particular area. Like here, we would avoid spraying at all costs because of the nematode beetle. We would do all of our pruning in late winter or midsummer here, because that beetle is not present as much on oaks. They can be pruned summer or winter. Pruning, flowering trees and fruit trees should be pruned after they bloom. Again, this depends on when it sets fruit. So some fruit trees you actually prune before they bloom, and some you prune right after they bloom. So know your material and when to do it. There are also some plant growth regulators out there that can help you with pruning. So you might establish pruning or do crown reduction pruning because you're trying to keep the tree visually in scale with a house. Applying a plant growth regulator can help keep that tree that size for much longer, meaning that you're not going to be pruning as frequently, also meaning that you're not going to be wounding as many times as you would without the plant growth regulator. They're effective in pretty small amounts over a long period of time. Something like Hambistat or paclobutrazol, one application of paclobutrazol on certain plants can last 9 to 10 years. At a minimum, they last about 4 years. So it's pretty long-term product that can reduce growth by 60 to 70%. They are an anti-gibberellin. That's what paclobutrazol is. It gets in there and interrupts that accumulation of gibberellic acid at the apical meristem, and that's what's responsible for that big shoot growth in the spring. So by putting in a blocker there, it doesn't accumulate those gibberellins. They're actually, the energy is used down in the root system, so it can redirect and be beneficial to a root system. So pruning, they can also reduce the pruning expenses because you're not doing it as often. They can reduce water sprouts and reduce future growth, especially under power lines and things like that. All right, well, that brings us to the end of the pruning section. So on that tree out front of my home that cut off that last branch, this is what I found inside. So at some point there was a little bit of wounding, and there was almost this perfect little face inside of there. And I track this over time. And remember when I said that damage often happens with that final cut right along the bottom? So you can see this nice white line that goes all the way around. That's the active cambium. And over here, it kind of becomes obscure. Well, the callus material has not developed in this area, hasn't even started to develop in this area yet, and is fully formed in the rest of it. And this is because I tried to rush the cut at the very end. So even though I got the perfect angle on it, still you can see the bark separation right there from the cambium. So it did wind up in some damage, but that's it. So any questions?
Yeah, just if you have any questions, let us know in the Q&A. Oh, here, we've got a question in the chat. What about topping Bradford pear trees?
So that's one of those things where you're thinking about your objective. To the general public, the arboricultural community wants to stay away from topping because it sort of sends the message that topping is okay, because they don't stop to consider what the objectives are. So if you have a fairly mature Bradford pear and you're wanting to reduce the likelihood that it splits apart, if you can get that tree to live from 12 years when it would typically pop apart to 20 years when it would probably still pop apart, topping would be an acceptable way to achieve that end. Bradford pears are fairly good compartmentalizers. They do not suffer massive amounts of decay as a result of pruning. So whatever you can do to limit those huge branches from popping off is going to improve their chances. When I worked up in Minnesota on a project for DuPont, it was pretty common up there for people to shear their Bradford pears. So they would go through and just shear the tops of them off. They'd have these perfect allays of Bradfords that would last for several decades. So, but the problem is in the perception of what that does in our industry. So it still reduces the energy. It has all those damaging effects. So you have to manage the client expectation and manage your company's perceived reputation by doing something like that.